Let's speak more on this. We're joined by Professor Nuraan Davids, Philosophy of Education, Stellenbosch University, to tell us about the significance of the day. Thank you very much, Professor Davids, for joining us. Perhaps let's go a step back and look at this concept of social justice. What are we talking about?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's one of those terms that have been bandied around. That has been bandied around for a while now. It's accompanied our transition from an apartheid state to a democracy. It sits in practically every single policy document. It underscores our education system. It underscores our health system. It underscores our curriculum in a very clear way that part of what we ought to be doing in schools and education is to advance social justice and to inculcate a socially just society. So it's a rhetoric almost, I would say, because it's an ideal that we haven't quite attained that permeates our political reform, our policy reform, but it is yet to reach our citizenry and it's yet to reach our people. And I think therein lies the big issue of how do we implement social justice? What do we understand by a socially just society? How do we get to a socially just society?
Let's unpack that. As you rightfully mentioned, it's just a term that has been bandied about. You talk about a socially just society. What is your assessment of South Africa in particular, I guess, when we take a look at what we're trying to achieve here?
Okay, so I think first it's important to understand that the notion of social justice can be interpreted differently, right? So we've had many scholars who's interacted with this term, who's written on this term, initially coined by Amartya Sen and people like Martin Nussbaum and David Miller and Nancy Fraser and John Rawls. So it's a term that's been used quite extensively in certainly in political philosophy as well as sociology. But in South Africa, I think the way we've tried to understand it politically and in terms of our policy is we've coupled it with this term transformation and democracy. And so what we're looking for is equal participation of all individuals and all groups where everybody's needs are met. And so that seems to be the conceptualization in South Africa. Now, immediately there are arising questions from this kind of understanding of social justice because we know from the outset that South Africa is deeply disparate, that South Africa is described as one of the most unequal societies in the world. And so automatically, if we speak about social justice, then if we're going to adopt the distributive framework or model where we have to distribute resources, if that's the model we want to go for, then automatically we have to recognize that there are certain sectors of society that needs more resources, that needs more input than other parts of society. And unfortunately, if I were to cast my eye over the last 27 years, not enough, and I would go as far as saying blatant neglect has happened with regards to the fact that we have not quite addressed the needs of those communities who are clearly in more need than others. And therein lies this rising concern and this almost kind of blemish that is festering and festering in terms of inequality that's making this divide wider and wider and making people more and more desperate.
Much has been said about South Africa's constitution. Much has been said about South Africa's transition to democracy. Much has been said about the Rainbow Nation. So on the back of what you were saying, especially with regards to the distributive framework that we still have not gotten it right 27 years down the line, should tell us what. Are there other world examples as people look to South Africa to say maybe that's the way to go? Can we take a leaf from somebody's book? And how do we even begin to address that?
You know what? I think we have this amazing constitution. There's no doubt that this constitution offers us an immense set of rights and also an immense set of responsibilities. And we can certainly take pages out of people's books, and we can certainly begin to take heed of trends that have worked. But ultimately, there is something which is already identifiable in South Africa which is holding us back. And that is, it's a combination of a lack of political will coupled with immense patterns of corruption, which has prevented us from going forward. And so it doesn't really matter which policy we adopt. It doesn't really matter that we have this amazing constitution. It's about the people. And if we don't instill and if we don't have strong, accountable, ethical leadership, then we cannot get to this conversation about social justice, because if your leadership and governance structures are unjust and unjust and perpetuate injustice in the way they respond to society, if you just take simple examples of how poverty alleviation is managed in Africa, if you look at health, you look at schooling, I can take any example of the public sector and show you just how dysfunctional that is. And that ultimately comes down to poor governance. And so what we need is a marriage of this amazing policy reform, which we've had, but we need the right people. And so perhaps the time has come to maybe change the conversation away from a distributive framework and get to an almost more fundamental level of what's missing. And that is human dignity and recognizing the rights of people to human dignity. Because if I look at you as somebody who has the right to human dignity, then automatically all the other issues which beset our society, like poverty being number one here, and what that creates and puts into play for people, then automatically I'm going to have a better regard for you. And that's missing. And so I think part of our challenge in South Africa, and we've had this ideal at one point in almost a kind of idealistic coming together of a new democracy, amazing leaders leading us into that democracy, and a people in support wholeheartedly of that. Of course, there were a few that weren't, but generally the world watching. And we've just lost that. And I think part of that is because we have allowed racial inequality, apartheid, to be replaced by a greed and a class apartheid. And we have to get back to what it means to see the dignity in others. And we have to get back to a place where we want to be treating each other with human dignity.
This, as we are monitoring developments in Johannesburg, Operation Dudula, going to various places, wanting the employment of South Africans. You talk about the racial tensions that manifest every now and again in the country. So will we ever find the pot at the end of this rainbow nation, or do we really run the risk of being another derailed African state?
I hate to be negative, and I'm in education, so my job is one that I can't be negative. I have to believe that we can turn this around. And you see pockets of it in civil society, you see pockets of it in NGOs, you see the mobilization of people who are saying, no, we will not allow our democracy to derail. And I do attach a lot of hope to education in South Africa. I still see it as a vehicle to change the narrative. But we have to start affording education its rightful place in our society. And I'm not just saying this because I'm in education. I think it's logical that if you provide young people with opportunities, if you believe in them, if you instill hope in them, if you provide them with settings which are conducive to them flourishing, then automatically you put into effect a kind of citizenship. You put into effect a kind of human being who's responsible, who's aware of his or her surroundings, who wants to give back. And so there's always opportunity for us to get back onto the path, to get back onto the kind of narrative which put into place our democracy. And we have to begin to understand that the only way we are going to get there is to reprioritize education in this country by fixing up our schools, by making sure we have qualified teachers, by getting our kids back into school, by making sure that children at risk, and risk here means hungry, pregnancy, poverty, unemployment, not having access to schools, then these children have access and that they are supported. If we can get our education system right, from ECD, early childhood, right up to tertiary, and provide access to people to tertiary and not just university, tertiary institutions, then automatically we have a better chance of creating employment.
Yep.
And we have a better chance of alleviating poverty. So I remain hopeful, and I think as an educator, as teachers, we have a dual role in not only teaching about what it means to be socially just and creating a socially just society, but our schools have a responsibility in ensuring that the spaces which they create and cultivate are also socially just. And what I mean by that is that learners ought to be in schools where they are treated with dignity and equality, so that we don't see the kinds of racism and violence we're seeing at schools like Jan Viljoen, for example. And of course, Jan Viljoen is just one of the schools where you get this. And so the idea of a school provides us with an opportunity to get this right every single day. But there has to be political will for us to do that.
Get them while they're young, you say. Thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon.
Pleasure.
Professor Nuraan Davids is from the Stellenbosch University's Department of Education Policy.